Well, welcome to week 2. We're going to be continuing our discussion of slavery in pre-Civil War America. We have multiple issues to talk about that are going to lead us up to the brink of war. And I know that Fleming's book actually goes beyond the brink of war. And as you read that, I want you to pay really close attention to his discussion of Lincoln. I think it's a very interesting discussion about Lincoln, but it will also carry you through into the next book. And you'll see with each of these books there's a little bit of overlap, but it's not redundant overlap. They all have very specific things to say about the Civil War. So let's move forward and let's talk about some of the major issues that are happening in the mid 1800s that are going to lead us to not only a larger debate about slavery, but also lead us to some pretty significant tensions about it. One thing I like to point out about slaves is that we often don't give them any agency in terms of the narrative. And it's really disrespectful to slaves to not be able to recognize that they were quite powerful people, and they were people who were able to create for themselves a life within bondage. And we're going to be talking about on the next slide the idea that, remember I talked last week about how the slaves of the low country, because the masters weren't so hands-on there, that they were able to create a culture for themselves. Well, those slaves are actually able to create an economic marketplace for themselves as well. They become artisans, and they become people who are able to sell produce, things that they've cultivated in their own little mini gardens on the plantations, that they're actually able to become business people. They're actually able to become traders. And so it's very interesting that often in the more broader historical narrative, that we don't really talk about the ability of Africans to carve out a very particular life for themselves, even though they were in bondage. And we talk about the freed slaves. We talk about slaves in terms of those who run away, but we also don't necessarily talk about those people who were able to use the economic marketplace in order to pay their way to freedom. And so it's something that we don't necessarily talk a great deal about. But we also don't talk about the fact that violent revolt, or the desire for violent revolt, or even say Dred Scott, who sues for his freedom, we don't really talk about the agency behind that. We don't talk about the fact that these are people who, for all intents and purposes, should think of themselves as having no power whatsoever. And yet they do a very good job of carving out a bit of power for themselves, even in their horrific circumstances. So let's talk a little bit about this. In 1831, Nat Turner actually created a rebellion in Virginia, and he gathered up a bunch of slaves, and they decided to violently revolt against the plantation owners. And around 60 whites were killed in this particular rebellion. It really didn't turn out the way that Nat Turner wanted it to, particularly because he was not free. The people who helped him were very quickly rounded up, and they were executed. And then 2 months later, Nat Turner is found, and he is executed as well. And one of the reasons why we talk a great deal about Nat Turner's rebellion is because it actually raises the fears of Southerners that there are going to be significant slave rebellions. In actuality, there aren't many future rebellions, and there are very few that are as violent as this one, and there are very few whites that are killed because of rebellion. But another thing that happens because of this particular revolt is that there's the creation of slave patrols in the South, and the slave patrols are going to be on the lookout for violence or the desire for revolt among slaves. And what the rebellion actually does is it actually creates this significant fear and fervor about the idea of African American revolt. And this is where we're going to see sort of the seeds of what we will talk about as we get closer to the Civil War. Really sows the seeds of the idea that Africans need to be, quote unquote, kept in their place. and that they should not be freed because, goodness gracious, what would happen to society and to white society if they were freed, and what kind of violence would they perpetuate against whites once they were freed. So this really raises some of those ill-founded concerns, and it also really is something that whites in the South run with. Again, creating slave patrols, starting to spread rumors about additional revolts, and it's really one of those watershed moments in American history in terms of sort of another turning of the tide in terms of how Africans are thought of. When you are reading through your book, you'll also see the discussion of racial theories too, and that's something that I want you to focus on, because in the 1850s, this discussion of racial theories, and particularly things like social Darwinism, are going to again turn another tide in terms of how Africans are thought of and Africans are treated, and it really is something that again is used against Africans in terms of, oh, hey, we have scientific proof that somehow you're inferior, okay? And so this is something that's certainly it's again ill-founded science, but it's something that is used against Africans. Now, in terms of the middle of the 1800s, we have two very significant events in terms of agency for African Americans, and also this idea of, and again, as I mentioned agency, what I mean by this is the idea that, as we move toward Dred Scott here, the idea that for all intents and purposes, African slaves should have pretty much thought of themselves as non-influential, without power, and without the ability to take on, say, the U.S. government or their slave masters or whatnot, right? But in terms of this discussion of agency, we can really see that many African slaves are able to, again, not only carve out a life for themselves on the plantations. Many learn how to read. Many, again, learn to become a part of the economic marketplace. Some of them create their own understandings of religion, their own understandings of their own personal culture. They create a little society or community for themselves. But we can certainly see in terms of people like Dred Scott that they've been able to not only do that for themselves, but to sort of step outside of this, to step outside of this role, and to recognize themselves as not only worthy human beings, but also people who could affect some sort of change, not only for themselves, but for others. And so Dred Scott's story is very interesting. He was born into slavery in Virginia, and he is moved by his slaveholder to the free territory in the North. And the problem for Dred Scott is that he believed, because he had lived so many years in free territory, that somehow that didn't make him a slave anymore. He decides to sue for his freedom in 1856. The ruling comes down in 1857 that slaves are not citizens. And so the Dred Scott decision is very significant for Africans. It is significant in terms of someone like Dred Scott actually taking on the federal government, particularly going to eventually the Supreme Court for this decision. But the wheels were turning for people like Dred Scott. How long do I have to live in free territory in order to be free? Other blacks would think, how much do I have to pay in order to pay for my freedom? How far do I have to run away in order to get freedom? And for Dred Scott, he really believed that because of living in free territory for so long, that this would grant him some sort of freedom. And this particular decision really illustrates the ideas that are running through particularly Southerners' minds in terms of who slaves are. That we've talked about the codification of slavery, and we talked about that last week, and Fleming talks about that. But here we have this very significant decision. We talked about the 3/5 clause, right? That they were 3/5 of a person. Well, at this point in time, Africans and African Americans, slaves who were born into slavery on American soil, they are very quickly turned into non citizens, and they're not going to get citizenship status back until the Reconstruction period, and that's very quickly going to be taken away from them in terms of right. They may still legally be citizens, but those rights are taken away from them. So you can see that the Dred Scott decision is a very significant point in African American history. It's also a very significant point in terms of abolitionist history, because for abolitionists and for also people who wouldn't necessarily consider themselves abolitionists but believed that slavery and the institution of slavery was abhorrent, that this is a point in time where they really get involved in the larger debate about whether or not the United States should have slavery rather. And in terms of history, this is a very significant turning point for not only this debate, but how it ramps up how aggressive this debate is going to be. And it ramps it up on both sides, both on in terms of the South and in terms of the North as well. And we're going to see this as we move forward. So let's talk about John Brown's raid. And John Brown was a white man. John Brown believed that slavery was abhorrent. He was a very particular abolitionist who believed in a violent slave rebellion and the violent overturning of the idea that the United States should be a slave-holding nation. He wanted a major slave rebellion, and he thought that if he landed at Harper's Ferry in Virginia, that he would be able to take Harper's Ferry, which he was, and then start bringing slaves into his column and bringing slaves along with him as he moved down further into the South, and that the more slaves he would be able to gather, and he had a ton of ammunition with him, that they would be able to violently overturn slavery in the South. And it doesn't work for him. Actually, the United States government it actually sends out troops against John Brown, and we have this major slave rebellion that really in John Brown's eyes could have succeeded. It's tamped down very, very quickly. John Brown is actually eventually executed as well, and so are other people who are a part of this raid, especially the slaves who are a part of the raid. But what's interesting is that in terms of the execution of, say, Nat Turner and also the execution of John Brown, that these are points in time where people who are against slavery again start ramping up their discussion, their debate about slavery. And it's John Brown's execution that really starts the idea of people throughout the North really pushing much harder in terms of this debate, and also again becoming to the point where not only are they aggressive in terms of their debate, but many of them start to accept the idea that maybe there needs to be a violent rebellion in order to stop slavery. So I mentioned in the previous slide the Underground Railroad. And the Underground Railroad actually was in existence in the early, or in the late rather 1700s, so around the 1790s. But it's not until the 1830s and beyond that it really becomes a significant network of safe passages and safe houses in the North, and then beyond into Canada. And one of the things I would stress is that for many slaves, the idea is, how far is far enough, right? Because not only if they went into the North would they be rounded up by Northerners who were not abolitionists, who were not concerned with the idea of abolishing slavery, but also if they went up into Canada, there were often people who followed them, almost like bounty hunters, who would follow them, round them up, and bring them back. Now, Fleming actually discusses the fact that it's really only about 2,000 slaves a year in this period that are actually able to get into the North and maybe even into Canada, and that those are mainly from people who are from the northernmost portions of the South. Because think about this, it would be very difficult if you were in Georgia to make your way all the way up the eastern seaboard and get to Philadelphia, or even to get up to, say, Ohio and get to Columbus, or go up to Indiana. It would be much more difficult because of the fact that you have all of these traps along the way, right? All of these places that you can get caught. And in terms of the terrain, think about the idea of, say, moving from Atlanta across the Appalachians and then up into, say, some place like Indiana or Ohio, and almost nearly impossible, right? So the vast majority of those slaves that are actually able to use the Underground Railroad are those who, and get to the North, are those who are in those states that border the North. Now, there are some that are actually able to come from Georgia, particularly, and move into Florida, and then eventually move on into the Caribbean, which is obviously a very interesting concept, considering the fact that many of their ancestors actually came from the Caribbean in terms of that triangular slave trade. But as we see here in terms of this map, you can see that by 1860 there's a significant network, right? But again, there are not a lot of slaves that are able to make their way through the Underground Railroad. But the point of talking about the Underground Railroad in terms of American history is not only to illustrate agency again of slaves, but to also illustrate that there were many people in the North who were willing to even risk prosecution in terms of helping slaves. And it was in the 1830s that there was an act that was created that would force local governments to seize and return slaves to their rightful owners, and also to prosecute those who had helped runaway slaves. But in 1850, there's an augmentation of this act, and this is the act that we often talk about in terms of American history, and that's the Fugitive Slave Act. So you still have that understanding that local governments can seize and return slaves, and that people who had helped would have been prosecuted. But the additions really are that almost everyone are thought of as needing to assist in recapturing slaves. It's not just local governments now. It's everyone in the North is supposed to assist in recapturing slaves. And also, and I'm sorry, there's a typo here. I said trial here, but there's no trial by jury for slaves in terms of the Fugitive Slave Act. So once you are found, you are shipped back immediately. You can't even go, and before you can't even go to court and try and prove that you were free, that you had paid for your freedom, that you had been released somehow by your slave owner. By this point, there would be no trial by jury for slaves, and there would be no way for them to prove that they were actually free. Also, with the Fugitive Slave Act, actually, and this is something that is going to turn the tide again in terms of abolitionism, is the idea that there will be much harsher punishments and greater prosecutions of those who had helped. So people were prosecuted before, but the idea was that they were going to ramp up the prosecutions, because often some of these would go by the wayside. But they would ramp up prosecution, and they certainly would inflict harsher punishments on people who had helped slaves. And that indicates the fact that the Underground Railroad was working, right? And also you can recognize the fact that between 1850 and 1860 is the time period in which the most Africans are able to use the Underground Railroad and to get out of the South. So it again illustrates the fact that the idea of creating, carving out a life for yourself, number one, in your own community, in the slave community, but also the idea that you could carve out a life for yourself outside of that community. And again, if we continue to talk about this, it really illustrates the idea that Africans really had a significant amount of power for themselves, even in a situation where it felt as though they had none, right? They were actually able to circumvent things, right? That certainly they were under the umbrella of bondage, but that they had this great spirit and this great drive to somehow carve out something for themselves under that umbrella. And I think that's a very interesting point that Fleming brings up as well, this understanding of agency. I think you have to do a little bit of critical thinking as you're reading through Fleming to pick up on this. But he really discusses so much of the efforts by Africans, by African slaves, by African American slaves to get out of bondage or to help others to get out of bondage. So it's a really important period of time. Also, I would suggest here we're talking about the Fugitive Slave Act. It's 1850s, and the 1850s, the reason why there's this ramping up of this is not just because of the Underground Railroad, but also because of the fact that we're talking about the the admittance of states in the formerly unorganized territories of, say, Kansas and Nebraska. And so the fights that come about because of Kansas and Nebraska really ramps up the abolition movement, and also ramps up the slavery movement. And so you can see this is another reason why the Fugitive Slave Act is enacted, why the earlier act is augmented, because of the fact that we're really getting to a boiling point here. And I want you to really focus on that in terms of the Fleming book. I'm not really talking a great deal about the boiling point yet, but Fleming does a great job of this, of showing how the tensions are going. And the tensions have a great deal to do with territorial expansion, which is what we're going to talk about in our next slide. And we talked about this last week, right? The idea that the more territory that the United States had, the more of a discussion there was going to be in terms of slavery. So as people continue to move further to the west, as more land is acquired by the United States in the west, this is going to create a great deal of frustration by people who are against slavery about the consideration and the possibility that there were going to be more slave states. And we'll talk about in a second why this is going to be a rather significant issue, because of the fact that the Missouri Compromise is struck down by another law. So we'll talk about that in a second, but I want to get to this last point here, and I had talked about this before, the idea of slaves buying their freedom. And many slaves are actually able to buy their freedom, but they're not able to live in the South, right? They have to actually go to the North, or they have to go out into unorganized territories or places that are not states yet. And so I really want to stress this idea of the fact that slaves were actually able to gain money for themselves. They were actually able to obtain money. One of the ways that they're able to do this, as I mentioned, is that the slaves in the Low Country and even in places like Georgia and Alabama were able to create for themselves these marketplaces, right? They were able to become artisans. They were able to actually become small produce farmers. And they were able to sell those things on the market, and they were able to garner money for themselves. But the other thing that they were able to do was to illustrate to slave owners that they could actually and would actually be more productive if they were paid. And so this is something that happens especially when cotton becomes king in the South, is that many slaveholders start paying, it's a pittance, but they start paying some of their slaves even though they're still in bondage. And the idea here is for efficiency and harder working slaves. And this also is this idea too that you can then move yourself away from being a slave master, and that you can actually trust your slaves to do what it is that you want them to do because you're actually paying them. And again, it's a double-edged sword, because of the idea that some of these slaves will actually buy their freedom, but you get significant productivity out of these particular slaves that are being paid. So let's move on away from the idea of agency, and let's start talking about the boiling point in terms of moving toward the Civil War. Well, we talked a great deal last week about the idea of territorial expansion being one of those roads that leads back to slavery, right? That the territorial expansion of the United States is what's going to ramp up the debate over slavery. And one of the places that it ramps up quite considerably is the admittance of Texas as a state in the Union of the United States of America in 1845. Now, Texas had been a republic for 9 years before it was admitted as a state. And this long 9 years is really an illustration of the significant debate that went on as to whether or not Texas was going to have a great deal of slaves within its population. The concern was there were already slaves there, and the concern is that particularly for the ability of much of Texas soil, but not all of Texas soil, to be a very fertile ground for cotton, that southern plantations were going to expand out there, and that people, white settlers, were really going to flock to the area once it had become a state. And there again, it wasn't just the idea, obviously we know that after the Missouri Compromise, the idea was that anything below the Arkansas Territory was clearly going to, or that northern point, I should say, of the Arkansas Territory was going to be be a slave state. But the concern is how large Texas truly is, the population that was already there, the fact that there were already slaves there, and the propensity for the cultivation of cotton was really, really going to increase the slave population of Texas, and therefore the political power of Texas, and therefore slave states, right? So we have this political power issue that's always there. Now remember that the Republic of Texas beforehand, that Mexico had actually asked, it was Mexican territory obviously initially, and Mexico had actually asked white settlers to come out there. And when the settlers got there, they started to cultivate the land and understand the fact that there was the ability to cultivate cotton there. And by 1836, the idea was among white settlers there that they didn't want to actually be a part of Mexico, and they wanted to envelop Texas into the United States, hopefully, but that they absolutely positively wanted to become a republic. And that is where we see the Texas Republic go to war with Mexico. They actually obviously eventually win this war, and they are able to create their Republic of Texas. One of the things that for quite some time that Mexico would not Mexico would actually not look at Texas as a republic. It would actually consider that Texas was still a part of Mexico. But finally, with the Treaty of Velasco, they settled the fact that Texas had become a republic. But what was not settled was a very tiny piece of land that was bordered by the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. And so this disputed territory is going to be what heats up and allows for the Mexican-American War. But by the time we get to 1836, and by the time we get to, I think the Treaty of Velasco, I think is the next year, we have the rumblings of the Republic of Texas wanting to become a state within the Union. And so for those 9 years, Texas is really going to be a heated debate about the idea of whether or not it should be admitted into the Union, and many anti-slavery proponents, many abolitionists, are going to obviously not want Texas to become a state. Why can't it just be out there in terms of a republic? Or why can't we hold it as a republic for a while and then eventually envelop it after we figure it out, the slavery question? And obviously that's not what happens, but you can recognize the fact that it's almost a 10-year period of time where they're discussing this. So I won't belabor the point. You guys can look at this in terms of what Fleming says about it, because he has a great discussion about it. But I really want you to focus on this in this 9-year period, because if there's any point in time in the 1800s that illustrates how deeply this slave debate goes and how bad the slavery debate is going to go in future years, it's going to be those 9 years that they discuss whether or not Texas should be admitted as a state. But as we know, in 1845, Texas is admitted as a state. In the year following that, when we move toward the Mexican-American War, that disputed territory within Texas is what's going to, again, like I said, allow for a Mexican-American War. Now, there are multiple reasons why the Mexican-American War occurs. One of the main reasons for the Mexican-American War is the fact that the United States is territorially thirsty, and the main person who is territorially thirsty by the time we get to the beginnings or the rumblings of the Mexican-American War is President James K. Polk. I've done a great deal of research on James K. Polk, and obviously Thomas Fleming talks a great deal about him too, and we actually both agree on the idea that he has about the Mexican-American War, or the thirst for territorial expansion, and the Mexican-American War actually being created by James K. Polk, because not only because of the idea that he was, this fervent territorial expansionist who really wanted the United States to traverse the continent, from sea to shining sea, and that he wanted the ports in California so that we could get trade with Asia, and on and on and on and on. But Fleming also discusses the idea, and this is also in James K. Polk's diary, that he truly believed that the more land the United States had, the longer it would take for the slavery debate to pop, right? So it would take a longer period of time for people so they'd move out to these different areas, but they'd be scattered out so much that when they created their communities, it would take a very, very long time for them to create a community that would reach the numbers necessary in order to be admitted to the United States as a brand new state. And so what Polk thought was that the longer it took for states to become a part of the Union, or I should say territories to become a part of the Union, that would allow for us to figure out, as the United States of America, whether or not this was going to be a slave-holding union. So we actually thought, and obviously erroneously thought, that by gaining this territory, it not only was going to help the United States in terms of riches and in terms of territory, but it was also going to help the slavery question, and that he saw the slavery question heating up here. But his suggestion is that we could cool it down and we could put it off for a while, and maybe we could figure it out before it blew up in the way that it eventually would in the Civil War. So people knew that things were heating up, and this was one of the ways that Polk suggested that we could cool it down for a little while. But make no mistake, James K. Polk's number one desire was for territorial expansion in terms of riches and in terms of creating a larger United States, and absolutely being able to get those ports out in California. So by the time we get to the end of the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gives the United States a vast new area, right? They gain California, they gain what is now modern-day Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah. So there really are significant parcels of land here for people to come out to, and there's going to be a great deal of mineral wealth in these areas too. We always think about California, but there's obviously significant mineral wealth in places like Utah and also in Arizona. So this really actually is a point in time for the United States where the idea of territorial expansion, many people think that we've reached our peak in terms of territorial expansion. That the really only thing that we need to do, and this will be debated in terms of imperialism, because the United States starts to look outside of itself after the Mexican-American War. But we've created the land that we wanted to create in terms of traversing the continent, and now all we have here is to develop these unorganized territories. And what we're going to see is some of the unorganized territories that we already had before the Mexican-American War is going to be another hot spot for the slavery debate. And the two places that I'm thinking of are Nebraska and Kansas, which we're going to talk about in the next slide. But I really want to illustrate to you guys that this idea of territorial expansion, and that, this erroneous idea of James K. Polk that somehow getting all of this territory was obviously, in his eyes, going to allow for a cooling down period. It does not allow for a cooling down period, and there's just fervent settlement throughout all of these areas. And a lot of people who are moving out to these areas actually end up settling in the Nebraska and Kansas territory as well. So this really is something that for the United States is really not going to allow for a ramping down of the slavery debate. It's going to ramp it up quite a bit. One of the things, we have the Wilmot Proviso in 1846 that was actually created with the idea that during the Mexican-American War, we already knew what our eyes were on in terms of the prize, right? We already knew, especially California, and that the war was going well enough that we were going to take other areas of Mexican territory, northern Mexican territory as well. So there was this attempt by anti-slavery advocates to ban slavery in the newly acquired territories. And this obviously would go against the Missouri Compromise, but the Missouri Compromise that really only stretched to a particular point, right? It didn't traverse the entire United States. So their idea is that the line doesn't need to be extended out to the Pacific Ocean, that we need to have a new plan here, and that new plan should be that slavery is banned in this newly acquired Mexican territory. Well, this proviso fails, but the point is that this is going to stir a very significant debate among people in the United States, and particularly among people in Congress. And I really want you to focus on the idea here that the Wilmot Proviso is one of those attempts that really illustrates that there were many people, especially in the North, and especially lawmakers in the North, who were unwilling to sit by and allow for slavery to keep expanding and expanding and expanding. But often we see that there's not only significant political power in the South, but we also see the fact that there are still many Northerners who aren't necessarily into the idea of slavery, who aren't necessarily slaveholders themselves, but they are people who don't really see what the harm is in having slaves. And they also are starting to get concerned, and you can see that the clock is inching closer and closer to the 1850s. They're starting to get concerned about what kind of a fervor it would create in the South if there was a change in terms of the Missouri Compromise that was not favorable to the South or favorable to slave states. And so there's this fear of what is going to happen and what's to come if we ban slavery in these newly acquired territories. So that's something that I want you guys to figure out and to really, I think Fleming does a good job of discussing this. The Wilmot Proviso is often, thrown to the side, but it's actually a really important, law that was at least put on the table in terms of really trying to stop the expansion of slavery. Maybe not to stop slavery altogether, but to stop its proliferation, right? And so this is obviously quite a big deal. Now, I've skipped ahead here in terms of the caning of Sumner, and this is going to happen after the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, but I'm skipping ahead here a little bit to talk about the caning of Charles Sumner. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is I really want you to start seeing, I talk about the heating up of the slavery debate, and it heats up to a point, I say this about the boiling point. It heats up to a point where it really actually explodes. And in the 1850s, this is the point in time where we see this significant explosion, that violence is starting to occur. And we're going to talk about the violence in terms of Bleeding Kansas in a minute. But violence happens in some of the strangest places during the discussions over slavery. And one of those places is the United States Congress. And Charles Sumner is a senator, and Preston Brooks was a representative, and Sumner actually had made a speech in the Senate regarding the idea of getting rid of slavery in the United States, and really condemned people who supported slavery and said some, really risque things about individuals who supported slavery and what some of their ulterior motives would be for wanting slavery beyond the idea of, economic advancement. And he obviously was opposed to the admittance of Kansas as a slave state. And I'm skipping ahead as well. We'll talk about Kansas-Nebraska in a second. But one of the differences here is that popular vote, the Missouri Compromise is struck down in 1854, and popular vote is what's going to actually allow for whether or not a slave is going to be admitted, a state rather is going to be admitted as a slave state or not. And so for Sumner, this is abhorrent that it looks as though Kansas is going to be brought into the Union as a slave state. And so he gets riled up, and he's one of those individuals who really gets riled up when he's talking about slavery and abolition. And he says some things, like I said, that are quite inflammatory, and you can read the story in terms of Fleming. But Preston Brooks finds him, and you see the cane here, and you see this golden tip of a cane. He actually beats Sumner for the speech that he gave. And you think about Congress as being a place of men who have wealth, and men who have education, and men who live by I don't want to say very particular rules, and I don't want to put like a 21st century spin on it. I'm not talking about corruption, but they live by very, very particular rules in terms of decorum, right? And so this is shocking, this idea that somebody would beat a United States senator, and let alone a representative beating a senator. Sumner actually suffered very severe injuries, what we would actually consider to be a traumatic brain injury in this day and age. And it took him about 3 years to actually fully, I shouldn't say fully recuperate, but to be able to function well again. And for the rest of his life, he actually suffered from pain and cognitive issues because of this caning. But the caning really illustrates the idea of this boiling point, right? And what's the boiling point going to be? 1854 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, as I had mentioned before, 1854, is a new act that replaces the Missouri Compromise. And this particular act is going to obviously get rid of the idea that there is this imaginary line, 3630, as to where above that line it's all free, and below that line it's all slave state. So for the replacement of this, even though that was an arbitrary line, and it still had, by definition, this significant effect on the political power of the South and the North, that it kept it as balanced as possible, right? And so, as we talked about with the Wilmot Proviso, the idea that in the North, the hope was that the line would not extend, right? And that proviso gets thrown away. So people are really concerned about the idea that you're still going to have a great deal of slavery in the United States, the extension of that line all the way to the Pacific, and that obviously the entirety of the southern United States, from sea to shining sea, is going to be allowed to be slave-holding states. So there's considerable concern over that. But the other concern is that there's also a great deal of land to be had, and a great deal of settlement to be done north of this line too, and especially after the United States acquires modern-day Washington and Oregon, it really is something that again becomes a significant factor. So the idea here, and the Southerners obviously went out on this, is that the line's going to go away. Okay, the line is not useful anymore. What will happen is that any slave that wants to be admitted into any state that wants to be admitted into the Union, any new territory that has met the requirements of becoming a state, has its own constitution, and wants to be enveloped into the United States of America, is going to actually hold a popular vote in terms of whether it's going to be a slave or a free state. And so this is obviously something that causes great fear on both sides of the fence, right? Because there's always the possibility that there could be more slave states. There's always this possibility that there could be more free states, right? And what actually happens in Kansas and Nebraska is that there are going to be numerous people that come from bordering areas who are pro-slavery or anti-slavery, who are going to come in and try and influence these areas in terms of their popular vote. Now, Kansas is the place that we think about the most. In Kansas, there actually were two different rival factions that created governments in Kansas, and nobody knew which one was the right government to go to, right? So nobody knew what the official government was, and this is before the actual election. The reason why this happened was because of the flooding in of people on both sides. Now, many of these people are going to try and take the real settlers and change their minds as to whether or not they want slavery or they don't want slavery. And this is one of the significant problems, obviously, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, is that the popular vote issue is not just the idea that, oh, somebody goes in and they go to the polling booth and they vote their own conscience, right? That often, even in the modern day, our political consciousness is really infiltrated by politicians, by people who want us to vote a particular way, right? Well, it's no different in terms of this, and this is why there was considerable concern over the fact that there were so many people flooding in and trying to change the minds of true settlers in the area. There were also people who were flooding in who weren't necessarily true settlers, but who were trying to get on the rolls in order to actually vote, so they could vote what it was that they wanted in terms of whether it would be a slave or a free state, and then they would go away. Now, in 1855, there is the significant violent eruption in Kansas called Bleeding Kansas. It's led by John Brown, who eventually will die at Harper's Ferry. But this is again one of those issues where violence is going to be the way that people think that they can finally settle the slavery question, right? And so John Brown actually perpetuates a great deal of violence there, as does the opposing side, and numerous people are killed, and that's why it's obviously called Bleeding Kansas. And you can read about this in Fleming's book, so I won't belabor the point. But the idea here is violence, 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 right? We already know that by 1854, 1856, with the caning of Sumner, that violence sort of rules the day in terms of the discussion of slavery. So how can it be that far off that there's actually going to be violence that erupts between the North and the South. And they don't necessarily know how that's going to actually occur, but that's going to be the significant concern. President Lincoln, before he becomes the president, while he's on the campaign trail, this is something that he consistently talks about: is, how is this going to end? We can't rip each other apart because of this. And so Kansas-Nebraska Act, the caning of Sumner, really illustrate to us not only that boiling point, but what that boiling point means, right? And the slavery debate becomes physical. The slavery debate becomes violent, right? Eventually, the people of Kansas, in a not so disputed vote, actually vote to become a free state. So it does not become a slave state. And obviously, the greater concern here was the fact that there was fertile soil there, also in terms of cotton, but also in terms of other types of produce. So the concern was, would there be little, mini plantations in terms of Kansas? Well, no, obviously, in terms of the vote. But in a few short years here, in about 7 years, we have the outbreak of the Civil War, and then in the next few years after that, this will no longer be a point, right? This will no longer be an issue as to whether there will be slave or free states and how is that going to be determined and all of that. Well, we see in a very short period of time, this thing that we've been talking about in the United States actually comes to a head. And one of the ways that it comes to a head is in the election of 1860. And everyone knows that President Lincoln finds the institution of slavery as abhorrent, right? And he really doesn't push the idea that he's going to get rid of slavery, but his philosophical ideas about it are already out there. They're out there well before he becomes the candidate for the presidency. So people in the South have a very particular vision of Abraham Lincoln, and that vision is that he's lying to us, and the minute he gets into power, he's going to do something to get rid of slavery, or he's going to wait a little bit and then bam, he's gonna get us all. And so the election of 1860 and the final outcome of that election actually spurs the issue of secession. And in December of 1860, just a few short weeks after the election of Lincoln, South Carolina actually votes to secede from the Union. 10 more states are going to follow. It takes a little bit of time for that. And there's the creation of the Confederate States of America, with their president Jefferson Davis and their capital in Richmond, Virginia. And so for America, and you're going to see this in terms of the lecture next week, I can consistently refer to the North as the United States, and I consistently refer to the South as either the South or the Confederate States of America. I don't think of there being a whole country at this point in terms of the North and the South. I only think of the United States as being the North at this point in time. So if you hear that, especially next week, you'll know what it is that I'm saying. The United States, I mean the North. The creation of the Confederate States of America, the placement of a president at its head, the creation of a capital really illustrates to the North, and especially to the federal government, that the South means business. They're not just seceding, and they're not just, kind of stepping away. That there's really going to, if the North wants to push a fight, there's going to be a fight. The major issue initially is the seizure of federal property by the Confederate States of America. Military forts, say throughout the South, but also in terms of Fort Sumter, which is the first place that we see the first shots of the war fired. But you can see here that we've talked about gradually how the debate over slavery evolves, right? It just keeps going and going and going. But when we see this boiling point, especially with territorial expansion, and then as we move through Texas and Kansas and Nebraska, all of the new territory out in the West, that we can see the fact that as we get to that boiling point, think about how few short years it would be before we see this complete explosion. That debate in terms of Texas and the Republic of Texas and whether or not it's actually going to be a part of the Union, that long 9-year debate is a strong illustration of how important territorial expansion is to the actual explosion of the Civil War. And again, as I mentioned to you before, all roads obviously lead back to slavery, but I would suggest that territorial expansion is the #1 national reason as to why not only the slave debate heats up, but it reaches a boiling point and then eventually the war explodes. So that's it in terms of what we're talking about this week for the main terms. I hope that this is helpful for you in terms of trying to figure out some of the background that Fleming is not necessarily always providing. But I think that Fleming really does a great job of, I think he's a wonderful writer. And as you move through, you'll see that he's talking about a particular point and he'll mention something you might not know. And then next thing you know what he's talking about because he's done a great job of explaining this background point. And then he seamlessly pulls it right back to the story itself. So it's a really great book, and it really does. It is a very good illustration of the disease in the public mind during the 1800s, and certainly also in terms of the founding fathers. I think that's one of the greater debates that he has. So let's move along, and we'll talk about some of the significant themes that I want you to be looking at as you read through the Fleming book. So let's finish up here this week by discussing the significant main issues that Fleming brings up in the rest of the book. Now, #1, I want you to continue to think about his main argument, to see if he's proving the main argument, and to really get a sense of what it is that Fleming is trying to tell you. What's the broader story here? What is it in a nutshell that he's trying to say? But I also want you to focus on some of these other issues. #1, the fact that he consistently talks about and is threaded through his narrative the reaction of the founding fathers' descendants as the anti-slavery movement becomes larger and larger and larger. So I want you to pick up on that and what many of these descendants do and what side they're on in terms of slavery. He also discusses a great deal about the abolition movement, so I want you to focus on that to get a good sense of what this movement is about. But I also want you to get a sense of the fact that there are significant divisions among abolitionists. One division would be violent revolt against nonviolent revolt, right? So the idea here is that there are some pretty significant divides within the abolitionist movement that's going to cause them to not be a cohesive unit. And that lack of cohesiveness is really going to harm the movement. And Fleming talks a good deal about this. Also, I want you to look at the effect of slavery on the political parties. There's a significant change in the political system and the party system during the middle of the 1800s, and it has a great deal to do with territorial expansion and the issue of slavery. So look at that as well. Also, look at the racial theories. I discussed this before. Social Darwinism issues, ideas of there are always those ideas out there, unfortunately for Europeans, that they believe that Africans were inferior. But by the time we get to the 1850s, some people think they have scientific proof of this, and so they use it obviously against Africans and African Americans to suggest the fact that they should be in bondage. So I want you to think about those racial theories as well. And then I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that we really have some overlap in terms of these books. And so I, #1, don't think that it's redundant because I think each one of these books has something different to say when they do overlap. But I want you to pay really close attention because I think that Fleming's discussion of Lincoln is very, very interesting. And so I want you to look at Lincoln's role in the lead up to the war, and then I want you to look at Lincoln's role beyond that. You can obviously skim those sections that are somewhat overlapping. So once you get into the Civil War, if you want to skim a little bit more, you certainly can. But I do want you to pick up on some of the things that Fleming says about Lincoln and who he believed Lincoln was and how the Civil War actually affected Lincoln. So keep your eye on these very specific issues as you go through. As you're reading, if you pick up on issues that you think keep coming up or that keep sticking out to you, then add those to your list of main issues and the things that you think are important about the era, and then also in terms of the book and what you think is being brought up time and time again. So just keep your eyes on main issues. Some of you will be able to pick out other issues. Some of you will want to focus just on these. As long as you're getting the gist of the material, that's all it is that you really need to do, right? So if you can just pick up on just these specific ideas, and you're already ahead of the game, okay? So for next week, we're going to be moving full force into the actual war. We're going to be reading the Bruce Cattan book. And this book is, it's very dense, but it's a very interesting look at the war. It's also highly skimmable. And my lectures next week and the week after that are going to be focused on military aspects in terms of the Civil War. So until then, take care.